The hospital room smelled of disinfectant and despair. Racheal Adeleke sat beside her mother's frail form, watching as Grace Adeleke's chest rose and fell in labored breaths. The cancer had ravaged her once beautiful mother, leaving behind a shadow of the woman who had raised Racheal single-handedly for 25 years. Grace's eyes, though dimmed by pain, still held the fierce determination that Racheal had inherited.
"Call him," Grace whispered, her voice barely audible above the steady beep of machines. "Please, Racheal. I need to see him one last time."
Racheal's jaw tightened. She knew exactly who her mother meant. Chief Adebayo Adeleke, the wealthy businessman who had abandoned them when Racheal was just 3 years old. The man who had built an empire while they struggled in poverty, who had remarried into high society and forgotten he ever had a daughter. But seeing the hope flickering in her mother's eyes, Racheal couldn't refuse. She pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed the number she had memorized but never called.
Chief Adebayo Adeleke's voice boomed through the phone speaker, as commanding and cold as Racheal remembered from the few times she had seen him in the media. "Who is this?" he demanded, his tone already dismissive. Racheal took a deep breath, steadying herself against the magnitude of what she was about to say. "This is Racheal, your daughter. Mama is dying, and she wants to see you." The silence that followed was deafening. When Chief Adeleke finally spoke, his words cut through Racheal like shards of glass. "I have no daughter by that name. Grace Adeleke means nothing to me. She never did. Don't call this number again." The line went dead, leaving Racheal staring at her phone in shock. Her mother's hopeful eyes searched her face, and Racheal felt her heart shatter as she realized she would have to deliver the crushing blow. But as she looked at Grace's expectant expression, something darker took root in Racheal's chest. A cold, burning fury that would change everything. Grace Adeleke died 3 days later. Her last words a whispered apology for the father who never came. Racheal held her mother's lifeless hand as the machines fell silent, her tears mixing with a rage so pure it felt like molten steel in her veins. She'd used her savings to pay for the funeral, a simple ceremony that Grace deserved so much more than. As she stood alone at the graveside, watching the coffin disappear into the earth, Racheal made a promise that would echo through the lives of everyone who shared Chief Adeleke's blood. "He took everything from us, Mama," she whispered to the freshly turned soil. "His money, his status, his new family, all built on the foundation of our suffering. But I swear on your grave, he will pay for every tear you shed, every night you went hungry, every moment he made you feel worthless." The wind picked up, rustling through the cemetery trees like a dark benediction. Racheal Adeleke walked away from that grave a different person than the one who had approached it. She was no longer just a grieving daughter. She was an instrument of vengeance, and Chief Adebayo Adeleke's family would learn the true cost of abandonment.
Racheal returned to her small apartment with a burning purpose. She cleared her kitchen table and spread out everything she could find about Chief Adebayo Adeleke and his family. Newspaper clippings from business magazines, society pages featuring his glamorous wife Funmi, photos of his 3 children from his second marriage. She studied each face with methodical precision, memorizing every detail. The twins, Camille and Tolu, were 22 and fresh out of university. The youngest, David, was 19 and reportedly the apple of his father's eye.
She spent the next several weeks building comprehensive profiles on each family member. Chief Adeleke owned a conglomerate spanning real estate, oil, and telecommunications. His wife Funmi was a former model turned socialite who ran several charitable foundations. The irony wasn't lost on Racheal. The twins were both pursuing master's degrees abroad, while David was studying business at the University of Lagos. Each had their own social media presence, their own friends, their own routines. Most importantly, each had their own vulnerabilities that Racheal began to catalog with surgical precision. Racheal quit her job as a nurse and withdrew her mother's small life insurance policy. The money wasn't much, but it would have to be enough for what she had planned. She enrolled in self-defense classes,
learned about computers and hacking from online courses, and began to reinvent herself completely. The grieving daughter slowly disappeared, replaced by someone harder, more calculating, more dangerous.
She changed her appearance first, dyeing her hair from black to auburn, losing weight through rigorous training, learning to carry herself with the confidence of someone who belonged in Chief Adeleke's world. She practiced different accents, different personalities, until she could slip in and out of characters like changing clothes. Most importantly, she studied the art of patience. Revenge, she learned, was not a dish served hot. It was a carefully orchestrated symphony that required perfect timing, precise execution, and an unwavering commitment to seeing it through to the bitter end. 3 months after her mother's funeral, Racheal made her first move. She had discovered that Fumi Adeleke frequented an upscale spa in Victoria Island every Tuesday for her weekly massage and facial treatments. Racheal arrived early that morning, dressed in designer clothes she had carefully selected from consignment shops, her new appearance polished to perfection. She sat in the waiting area with a book, looking every inch the wealthy socialite she was pretending to be. When Funmi arrived, Racheal was ready. She had practiced this moment countless times, rehearsing every gesture, every expression, every word. "Excuse me," she said with a warm smile as Funmi settled into the adjacent chair. "Aren't you Funmi Adeleke? I've seen your work with the Children's Heart Foundation in the papers." "I'm Racheal Johnson. I run a small nonprofit for orphan children." The lie rolled off her tongue smoothly, and she watched as Funmi's face lit up with genuine interest. It was almost too easy, Racheal thought, as she began to weave the web that would eventually destroy this woman's perfect world. Over the following weeks, Racheal carefully cultivated her relationship with Funmi. They met for coffee, attended charity events together, and Racheal even volunteered at one of Funmi's fundraisers. She played her role perfectly, the dedicated social worker who had overcome a difficult past to help disadvantaged children. Funmi, hungry for authentic friendship in her world of superficial society connections, embraced Racheal warmly. "You remind me of myself when I was younger," Funmi confided one afternoon, as they sat in her garden, sipping imported tea. "I had such dreams of making a difference in the world." Racheal nodded sympathetically, even as she mentally cataloged every detail of the Adeleke mansion's layout. She had been inside the enemy's fortress, had sat at their table, had earned the trust of the woman who had taken her mother's place. The bitter irony was that Funmi was genuinely kind, which would make what came next all the more devastating. Through Funmi, Racheal gained access to information about Kemi and Tolu, the twins who were studying in London. Kemi was pursuing a master's in international relations at King's College, while Tolu was at the London School of Economics studying finance. They were both active on social media, posting regularly about their lives abroad. Racheal studied their posts obsessively, learning their schedules, their favorite places, their friends, and romantic interests. She discovered that both twins would be returning to Lagos for Christmas, a perfect opportunity to make their acquaintance. Funmi had already invited Racheal Johnson to their annual Christmas party, and Racheal had graciously accepted. She would meet them face to face, would look into the eyes of Chief Adeleke's children and begin to understand exactly how she would tear their lives apart. The thought should have troubled her, but instead it filled her with a cold satisfaction. They had lived in luxury while she and her mother struggled. Now it was time for them to understand what loss truly meant. While building her relationship with Funmi, Racheal also began surveillance on David, the youngest Adeleke child. At 19, he was studying business administration at the University of Lagos and living in a luxury apartment his father had purchased near the campus. David was popular, confident, and completely unaware of the danger circling his family like a predator stalking its prey. Racheal followed him for weeks, learning his patterns. He attended classes regularly, played basketball with friends on weekends, and frequented an upscale nightclub called Platinum every Friday night. He drove a brand new BMW that cost more than most people earned in 5 years, wore designer clothes, and carried himself with the casual arrogance of someone who had never wanted for anything. Watching him laugh with his friends, completely carefree and oblivious to the suffering his father had caused, only strengthened Racheal's resolve. This boy had lived a charmed life while her mother died in poverty, but his charmed life was about to come to a very abrupt end. The Adeleke Christmas party was everything Racheal had expected. An ostentatious display of wealth that probably cost more than her mother's medical bills had been. The mansion was decorated with thousands of lights.
the gardens filled with ice sculptures and live entertainment. Lagos's elite mingled on the terrace, their jewelry catching the light as they laughed and gossiped. Racheal arrived fashionably late, wearing a black dress that had cost her 2 weeks' salary, but made her look like she belonged. Chief Adeleke stood in the center of it all, holding court like the king of his own empire. Racheal watched him from across the room, this man who had rejected his dying daughter's plea for help. He looked older than in his photos, his hair now completely gray, but he still radiated the same commanding presence that had once made her mother fall in love with him. When their eyes met across the crowded room, there was no recognition in his gaze, just the polite acknowledgement one gives to a stranger at a social gathering. That lack of recognition cut deeper than any insult could have. "Racheal, darling, come meet my family!" Fumi's voice cut through Racheal's dark thoughts as her unwitting accomplice approached with the twins in tow. Kemi and Tolu Adeleke were stunningly beautiful, dressed in designer gowns that probably cost more than a car. They had their mother's elegant features and their father's confident bearing. As Racheal shook their hands and exchanged pleasantries, she marveled at how easy it was to smile while planning their destruction.
"Mom talks about you all the time," Kemi said, warmly, her British accent a reminder of the privileged education she was receiving.
"Your work with orphans sounds absolutely inspiring." Tolu nodded in agreement, adding, "We should definitely collaborate when we're back in Lagos permanently. Fresh perspectives are always valuable." Their genuine enthusiasm for her fictional charity work might have been touching under different circumstances. Instead, it only reinforced how completely unprepared they were for what was coming. These spoiled children had no concept of real hardship, no understanding of the price their privileged existence had cost others. Later that evening, Racheal watched as Chief Adeleke put his arm around David's shoulders, introducing him to important business contacts with obvious pride. "This is my boy David," he announced to a group of investors. "He's going to revolutionize the family business when he graduates." The love and approval in the older man's voice was unmistakable, a warmth that had never been extended to Racheal, a pride that her mother had died hoping to see just once. David basked in his father's attention, his face glowing with filial devotion. This was clearly his father's favorite, the son who would inherit the empire, carry on the Adeleke name. Racheal studied the dynamic between them, noting how David hung on his father's every word, how desperately he sought approval and validation. That devotion would be Chief Adeleke's greatest weakness, and David's ultimate downfall. A plan began to form in Racheal's mind. Beautiful, terrible, and perfectly suited to destroy them both in the most painful way possible. As the party continued into the night, Racheal positioned herself strategically around the mansion, observing the family dynamics with clinical precision. She watched Fumi play the perfect hostess, graciously managing every detail while maintaining effortless charm. She saw how the twins supported each other, finishing each other's sentences and sharing private jokes. She noticed David's easy relationship with his siblings, how they teased him affectionately about his girlfriend troubles. This was a close-knit family bound together by love, shared experiences, and mutual respect. They had inside jokes, family traditions, and genuine affection for one another. It was everything Racheal and her mother had been denied, everything that had been stolen from them when Chief Adeleke chose his new life over his old responsibilities. The sight of their happiness didn't soften her heart, it hardened it further. They had built their joy on the foundation of her mother's tears, and Racheal would make sure they understood exactly what that cost. As the evening wound down, Racheal made subtle comments designed to plant tiny seeds of suspicion and doubt. To Kemi, she mentioned seeing someone who looks just like her father at a hotel with a young woman. Probably business, she added with a knowing smile. To Tolu, she casually wondered if their father's business practices were always completely ethical. Successful men often have to make difficult choices, she mused thoughtfully. None of her comments were direct accusations, just carefully placed observations that would fester in their minds like poison. She knew from her research that both twins had strong moral compasses and high expectations of their father. These tiny doubts would grow over time, creating fractures in their perfect family portrait. The beauty of psychological warfare was that the victims often destroyed themselves. They just needed the right push in the wrong direction. During a quiet moment on the terrace, Racheal found herself alone with David. He was slightly drunk and more talkative than usual, his guard completely down in the safety of his family home. "You know," he confided, leaning against the balcony railing, "sometimes I worry I'll never live up to Dad's expectations. He's achieved so much, built all of this from nothing. How do you follow that legacy?" Racheal listened with feigned sympathy, all while cataloging this vulnerability for future use. David's greatest fear was disappointing his father, failing to measure up to the impossible standard of success Chief Adeleke had set. This insecurity, hidden beneath layers of privilege and confidence, was exactly the weapon Racheal needed. "I'm sure your father is already proud of you," she said gently, placing a comforting hand on his arm. Inside, she was calculating just how devastating it would be when that pride turned to shame. When Chief Adeleke realized his beloved son would never inherit anything because he wouldn't live to see graduation. In the weeks following the Christmas party, Racheal began systematically building relationships with people in the Adeleke family's orbit. She befriended their housekeeper, Maria, by volunteering at the same church. She struck up conversations with David's university friends at the gym, where several of them worked out. She even managed to get invited to a book club that Kemi's best friend attended when the twins returned to London. Each relationship was carefully cultivated and maintained, providing Racheal with an intricate network of information sources. She learned about family arguments, business pressures, romantic relationships, and personal struggles. Most importantly, she began to understand the family's routine, their security measures, and their most vulnerable moments. Knowledge was power, and Racheal was accumulating an arsenal of information that would prove devastating when the time came to use it. Racheal spent hours researching Chief Adeleke's business empire, understanding its structure, its vulnerabilities, and its key relationships. She discovered that despite his public success, several of his companies were heavily leveraged, dependent on a complex web of loans and investor confidence. His telecommunications company was facing increased competition, his real estate ventures were sensitive to market fluctuations, and his oil interests were subject to government regulation and international price pressures. This financial vulnerability gave Racheal ideas for attacks that went beyond physical harm. She could destroy Chief Adeleke's legacy, strip away everything he had built, and leave him with nothing but the memory of the family he had lost. It would be a slow, agonizing death rather than a quick one, watching his life's work crumble while knowing it was retribution for his past sins. The thought filled her with dark satisfaction as she continued to map out every detail of his business operations. Maria Santos had worked for the Adeleke family for 15 years and knew them better than they knew themselves. Over coffee after Sunday service, she confided in Racheal about the family's private struggles. "Mr. Adeleke works too hard," she said, shaking her head with genuine concern. "Sometimes he doesn't come home for days, just sleeps in his office. Mrs. Fumi pretends it doesn't bother her, but I see her crying sometimes when she thinks no one is watching."
These intimate details painted a picture of a family that wasn't quite as perfect as they appeared publicly. Chief Adeleke's workaholism was straining his marriage. The twins were struggling with the pressure of living up to their father's expectations while abroad, and David was hiding his own insecurities behind a facade of confidence. Racheal filed away each piece of information, understanding that emotional vulnerability would be just as useful as physical weakness when the time came to strike. Racheal had spent months studying her target's online presence, learning their passwords through careful observation and social engineering. David used his girlfriend's birthday for most accounts. Kemi favored variations of her childhood pet's name, and Tolu's passwords always included references to his favorite football team. These digital keys gave Racheal access to their private communications, their location data, and their most personal thoughts. Through their messages, she learned about David's gambling problem. Small stakes for now, but enough to indicate a dangerous impulse control issue. She discovered Kemi's struggles with anxiety and her secret visits to a therapist in London. She found evidence of Tolu's growing resentment toward his father's controlling nature and his desire to prove himself independently.
Each revelation was another weapon in her arsenal, another pressure point she could exploit when the time came to begin her campaign of destruction.
6 months after her mother's death, Racheal finally had all the pieces in place. She sat in her apartment surrounded by files, photos, and timelines, her laptop open to multiple browser windows, displaying everything she had learned about the Adeleke family. The plan that emerged was complex, multi-layered, and designed to cause maximum psychological damage before delivering the final blow.
She would start with David, the youngest and most vulnerable. His death would be the opening move, designed to shatter Chief Adeleke's confidence and send shockwaves through the entire family. Then, she would systematically destroy the twins, using their own vulnerabilities against them. Finally, she would dismantle Chief Adeleke's business empire before confronting him with the truth of who she was and why his family had paid the price for his abandonment. Only then would she decide whether his death would be quick or slow, merciful or agonizing.
Racheal chose a Friday night when she knew David would be at Platinum Nightclub with his friends. She'd been monitoring his social media posts for weeks, noting his regular pattern of heavy drinking followed by increasingly reckless behavior. That night, she positioned herself at the bar, dressed to kill and armed with a small vial of colorless, odorless liquid that would enhance David's natural tendency toward poor decisions. When David ordered his usual whiskey, Racheal made her move. She bumped into him accidentally, spilling her drink and creating the perfect opportunity for conversation. "I'm so sorry," she exclaimed, her hand brushing against his glass as she helped clean up the mess. The drug was tasteless and would take effect gradually, creating the illusion of natural intoxication while actually impairing his judgment and coordination far beyond what the alcohol alone would achieve. Within an hour, David was more intoxicated than he had ever been, though he attributed it to the stress of upcoming exams and his father's increasing pressure about his future. Racheal stayed close, playing the concerned stranger who just wanted to make sure he got home safely. She skillfully separated him from his friends, convincing them she would personally ensure he reached his apartment without incident. "You're an angel," David slurred as they left the club together, completely unaware that he was walking with his executioner. Racheal had studied his building's security system and knew exactly how to bypass the cameras and door codes. She guided him to his luxury apartment, supporting his weight as the drug continued to work through his system. To any observer, they looked like a couple heading home after a night out, which was exactly what Racheal had intended. In David's apartment, Racheal helped him to his couch and made coffee, playing the role of the Good Samaritan perfectly. As the caffeine began to counteract some of the drug's effects, David's vision cleared enough to really look at his rescuer for the first time. Something in her eyes made him suddenly uncomfortable, though he couldn't articulate why. "Who are you really?" he asked, his instincts finally overriding his impaired judgment. Racheal smiled then, and it was the coldest expression David had ever seen. "I'm your sister," she said quietly, watching as confusion and disbelief flickered across his features. "Your father's first daughter, the one he pretended didn't exist while you lived in luxury and my mother died in poverty." The words hit David like physical blows, and Racheal could see the exact moment when understanding dawned in his eyes. "That's impossible," David whispered. But even as he said it, he could see the resemblance, something about her eyes, the shape of her face when she stopped smiling. Chief Adeleke had never mentioned another daughter, but David wasn't naive enough to believe his father had lived like a monk before meeting his mother. The possibility that this stranger was telling the truth made his blood run cold. Racheal pulled out her phone and showed him photos, her mother in her youth looking remarkably like Funmi, and pictures of Chief Adeleke from decades earlier with Grace Adeleke. "He abandoned us when I was 3, she continued, her voice steady and matter-of-fact. "Never sent money, never called, never acknowledged our existence. When my mother was dying of cancer, she begged me to call him. Do you know what your precious father said?" David shook his head, though part of him already knew the answer would destroy something fundamental about his worldview. "He said he had no daughter by my name. That my mother meant nothing to him. She died 3 days later, still hoping he might change his mind and visit." Racheal's voice never wavered as she delivered these devastating truths, but David could see the pain and fury burning in her eyes like twin flames. "So I decided that if I meant nothing to him, his precious family would mean nothing to me either." David tried to stand, to run, to call for help, but the drug was still affecting his coordination,
and the emotional shock was overwhelming his system. You can't... This isn't... There has to be another way to handle this, he stammered, his privileged worldview crashing down around him. Racheal laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Handle this? David, sweet, naive David. This isn't something to be handled. This is justice. This is what your father's choices cost.
From her purse, Racheal withdrew a small syringe filled with a clear liquid.
Potassium chloride, she explained clinically. It mimics a heart attack. Given your party lifestyle and the family history of cardiac issues, no one will question it. Just another privileged kid who partied too hard and paid the ultimate price. David's eyes widened in terror as the full reality of his situation became clear.
Please, he begged, trying to appeal to whatever humanity might remain in his sister's heart.
I never knew about you. I never hurt you or your mother. I was just a child when all this happened. Racheal nodded thoughtfully, as if considering his words. You're right. You were innocent then, but you weren't innocent of living in luxury while we suffered. You weren't innocent of enjoying the life that should have been partly mine, and your father's love that should have been shared with me. You took all of it, without ever questioning whether it was rightfully yours.
What do you want me to say? David asked desperately, tears streaming down his face. I'm sorry. I'm sorry my father was a bastard. I'm sorry you suffered. I'm sorry your mother died. I'm sorry for all of it. But killing me won't bring her back or change what happened. His words were raw, honest, and filled with genuine remorse for sins he didn't even know he had committed.
Racheal paused, the syringe held steady in her hand. For a moment, something flickered in her expression. A shadow of the woman she might have been if grief and rage hadn't consumed her soul.
You're right, she said. Killing you won't bring Mama back, but it will make your father feel the same helpless agony I felt watching her die. It will teach him that actions have consequences even if they come 22 years later.
She moved toward him with swift, practiced precision, and David's pleas for mercy were lost in the silence of his luxury apartment.
Maria Santos found David's body the following Monday morning when she came to clean his apartment, as she did every week. Her screams brought the building's security guard running, and within minutes the apartment was swarmed with police and paramedics. David lay peacefully on his couch, looking for all the world like he had simply fallen asleep and never woken up.
The initial examination suggested cardiac arrest, though the young man's age made it unusual. Chief Adeleke arrived at the scene within an hour, his face a mask of shock and disbelief as he stared down at his youngest child's lifeless form. For the first time in decades, the powerful businessman looked old and fragile, his commanding presence shattered by a grief so profound it seemed to emanate from his very bones. Watching from across the street, hidden among the crowd of onlookers, Racheal felt her first taste of satisfaction.
David's funeral was a grand affair, attended by hundreds of Lagos's elite who came to pay their respects to Chief Adeleke's fallen son. The twins flew in from London, their faces hollow with grief and disbelief. Kemi wept openly throughout the service while Tolu stood rigid with suppressed emotion. Fumi was sedated, barely able to stand as she said goodbye to the boy who had been the light of her life.
Chief Adeleke delivered the eulogy with a broken voice, speaking of David's dreams, his potential, his bright future that had been cut tragically short.
He was going to change the world, the grieving father said, his words echoing through the packed cathedral. He had such plans, such vision, and now... He couldn't finish the sentence, overcome by a sorrow that seemed to age him years in the span of moments. Racheal watched from the back of the church, her heart unmoved by the display of grief. This was only the beginning.
Detective Inspector Aduni Olgovi was assigned to investigate David Adeleke's death. A sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with a reputation for thoroughness, she wasn't entirely satisfied with the preliminary autopsy results. Young, healthy men didn't typically die of heart failure without underlying conditions, and David's medical records showed no history of cardiac problems.
She began interviewing David's friends, family, and anyone who had seen him in his final days. The club's security footage showed him leaving with an unidentified woman, but the camera's angles made it impossible to get a clear view of her face. Several witnesses described her differently. Some said she was tall, others short, some remembered blonde hair, others brown.
It was as if she had been designed to be forgettable, which in Detective Ogilvy's experience usually meant she was anything but innocent.
In the weeks following David's funeral, cracks began to appear in the Adeleke family foundation. Chief Adeleke threw himself into work with manic intensity, staying at the office for days at a time and refusing to discuss his son's death. Fumi, devastated by grief, began drinking heavily and became increasingly isolated. The twins, forced to return to London to complete their degrees, struggled with survivor's guilt and the growing distance they felt from their parents. Kemi called home every day, desperate to maintain connection with her fractured family. Tolu became angry and resentful, blaming his father's high-profile lifestyle for attracting tragedy to their family. "We're targets," he argued during one particularly heated phone conversation. "Dad's made too many enemies, and now we're all paying the price." None of them suspected that their enemy wasn't some business rival or disgruntled employee, but a woman who shared their blood and their father's eyes. With David's death successfully executed and ruled as natural causes, Racheal moved to the next phase of her plan. She had spent months cultivating her friendship with Funmi, positioning herself as a shoulder to cry on during this devastating time. "I'm here for whatever you need," she told the grieving mother, bringing home-cooked meals and sitting through long afternoons of tears and memories. Through Fumi's grief-stricken confidences, Racheal learned about the family's increased security measures, their travel plans, and most importantly, the growing paranoia about external threats. They were looking everywhere for danger except the place it actually resided, in their inner circle, wearing a mask of compassion and friendship. Racheal began to plan her approach to the twins, understanding that their grief had made them vulnerable in ways they didn't yet comprehend. Kemi Adeleke was struggling with severe anxiety following her brother's death. Her grades were slipping, she was having panic attacks, and she had become increasingly dependent on the prescription medications her London therapist had prescribed. Through careful manipulation of their mutual contacts, Racheal arranged to accidentally encounter Kemi during one of the twins' brief visits home to Lagos. "You look just like your mother," Racheal said with a warm smile when they met at a coffee shop in Victoria Island. "I'm Racheal Johnson. I've been helping your mom through this difficult time." Kemi's eyes filled with tears at the mention of her mother's struggle, and she gratefully accepted Racheal's offer of friendship and support. Within weeks, they were texting daily, with Racheal providing a sympathetic ear for all of Kemi's fears and anxieties. Racheal began subtly feeding Kemi's anxiety, suggesting that David's death might not have been natural, that the family might still be in danger. She shared concerns about strange cars she had noticed near the family home, mentioned seeing suspicious people, asking questions about the Adelekes around town. None of these observations were true, but they played perfectly into Kemi's existing fears. "Maybe you should consider taking a semester off," Racheal suggested during one of their late-night phone conversations. "Your family needs you right now, and you could use some time to process everything that's happened." Kemi was already considering the same thing, and Racheal's encouragement helped push her toward a decision that would prove catastrophic. Dropping out of her master's program would destroy her academic trajectory and eliminate her support network in London, leaving her isolated and more vulnerable to manipulation. Against her parents' wishes, Kemi dropped out of King's College and returned to Lagos permanently. She moved back into the family home, ostensibly to help her mother cope with David's death and her father's increasing absence. Chief Adeleke was furious about her academic decision, but was too consumed by grief and work pressures to fight her effectively. Kemi's constant presence at home gave Racheal unprecedented access to the family's inner workings. She visited regularly under the guise of checking on Funmi, but actually spent most of her time cultivating her relationship with the vulnerable twin. Kemi confided her deepest fears, her guilt about surviving when David didn't, her growing suspicion that their father was hiding something about David's death. Each confidence was another weapon in Racheal's psychological arsenal. Racheal began planting evidence of threats against the family. Anonymous notes left in places where Kemi would find them, hang-up phone calls at odd hours, mysterious cars parked outside the compound. She made sure the threats were subtle enough to seem real, but vague enough to maintain plausible deniability. Kemi's anxiety reached new heights as she became convinced that her family was being stalked by unknown enemies. "We need to hire more security," Kemi pleaded with her father during one of his rare appearances at home.
Someone is watching us, Papa. I can feel it. Chief Adeleke, already paranoid about business rivals and political enemies, took his daughter's concerns seriously. He increased their security detail, installed new alarm systems, and began varying his own routines. The irony wasn't lost on Racheal that she was helping them protect against an external threat while she remained safely embedded within their inner circle. While ramping up Kemi's paranoia, Racheal also began systematically isolating her from potential support systems. She subtly criticized Kemi's old friends, suggesting they couldn't understand what the family was going through. She discouraged Kemi from seeking professional help, arguing that therapists might not maintain confidentiality about such a high-profile family. Most effectively, she positioned herself as the only person Kemi could truly trust.
Everyone else sees your family's wealth and status, Racheal explained during one of their long conversations. They can't understand the burden you carry, the fear you live with every day. But I see you, Kemi. I understand what you're going through because I care about your family like my own. The words were poison wrapped in honey, designed to make Kemi increasingly dependent on Racheal's presence and guidance. Within months, Kemi rarely made decisions without consulting her new best friend first. In London, Tolu Adeleke was taking a different approach to processing his grief and anger. Unlike his twin sister, he refused to return home or accept his father's increased security measures. Instead, he threw himself into reckless behavior, heavy drinking, underground fighting clubs, and increasingly dangerous encounters with London's criminal underworld. He was acting out his rage in the most self-destructive way possible.
Racheal monitored Tolu's downward spiral through social media and carefully placed contacts in London's Nigerian expatriate community. His rebellion against his father's authority and his embrace of dangerous lifestyle choices made him an easier target than she had initially anticipated. She began laying groundwork for her approach to him, understanding that his anger and recklessness would be the keys to his destruction. Unlike Kemi, who needed to be slowly poisoned with fear, Tolu was already poisoning himself with rage.
Through her network, Racheal arranged to be introduced to Tolu during one of his visits to Lagos. She appeared at an underground boxing match where she knew he would be, playing the role of a thrill-seeking socialite looking for excitement outside her normal circles. Tolu was immediately attracted to her apparent fearlessness and her willingness to engage with his darker interests.
Thoughtful. "You're not like the other society girls," he told her as they shared drinks in a seedy bar after the fights. "You understand that sometimes you need something real, something dangerous, to feel alive." Racheal nodded knowingly, carefully mirroring his rebellious attitude while gathering intelligence about his psychological state. She learned that Tolu blamed his father not just for David's death, but for creating a family environment where tragedy was inevitable. This resentment would be the foundation for her manipulation strategy. Back in London, Racheal began corresponding with Tolu regularly, encouraging his most destructive impulses while pretending to share his rebellion against conventional morality. She introduced him to contacts in Lagos's criminal underworld, people who could supply him with increasingly dangerous thrills during his visits home. Each introduction pulled him deeper into a world where violence and criminality were normalized. "Your father thinks he can control everything," she wrote in one encrypted message. "But real power comes from being willing to do what others won't. You understand that in ways he never could." Her words fed Tolu's need for validation while simultaneously encouraging him toward increasingly reckless behavior. She was systematically dismantling his moral compass, preparing him for choices that would ultimately destroy not just his own life, but his family's reputation and his father's business empire. Through her careful cultivation of Tolu's criminal contacts, Racheal began to understand the extent of corruption and illegal activity that intersected with legitimate business in Lagos. Some of Chief Adeleke's associates had connections to money laundering, drug trafficking, and political corruption. This information gave her new avenues for attacking the family's empire from within. She began feeding Tolu information about his father's business dealings, carefully selected details that painted Chief Adeleke as a hypocrite who built his fortune on the same criminal foundations he publicly condemned. "He lectures you about morality while washing dirty money through his telecommunications company," she whispered during one of their clandestine meetings. Each revelation deepened Tolu's resentment and pushed him further toward the point of no return. While orchestrating the psychological destruction of the twins, Racheal continued her role as Funmi's confidant and support system. The grieving mother had become increasingly dependent on alcohol and prescription medications, a dependency that Racheal subtly encouraged by bringing wine during their visits and expressing understanding about the need to, quote, take the edge off such overwhelming pain. Funmi's decline was serving multiple purposes in Racheal's plan. It was destroying Chief Adeleke's home life, adding stress to his already overwhelming business pressures. It was also providing Racheal with access to family financial information, as Funmi had begun handling some of the household finances that her husband was too distracted to manage. Most importantly, Funmi's deteriorating mental state was making her vulnerable to suggestions that would ultimately compromise the entire family's security. Chief Adeleke's business empire was beginning to show cracks under the pressure of his personal grief and distraction. Key deals were falling through, important meetings were being missed, and rivals were beginning to sense weakness. Racheal had been subtly feeding information to competitors through intermediaries, ensuring that Chief Adeleke's moments of vulnerability were exploited to maximum effect. The telecommunications company was facing a regulatory investigation that Racheal had helped initiate through anonymous tips to government officials. The real estate ventures were being undercut by competitors who seemed to have inside information about pending deals. Chief Adeleke was fighting battles on multiple fronts, unaware that many of his problems were being orchestrated by the daughter he had refused to acknowledge. The pressure was designed to wear him down, to make him more susceptible to the devastating blows that were still to come. 8 months after David's death, Kemi's mental health had deteriorated to the point where she was barely functional. The combination of grief, anxiety, paranoia, and isolation had created a perfect storm of psychological instability. She rarely left a family compound, jumped at every unexpected sound, and had become convinced that her family was being watched constantly by dangerous enemies. Racheal judged that Kemi had finally reached the breaking point where she could be pushed into the final, fatal decision. During one of their regular conversations, she suggested that Kemi might be safer if she took a more proactive approach to protecting herself and her family. Sometimes, Racheal said carefully, the best defense is a good offense. You can't just wait for them to make the first move. The seed of violence was planted with surgical precision in Kemi's fractured psyche. Through Tolu's criminal contacts, Racheal arranged for an untraceable pistol to find its way into Kemi's possession. She made sure the young woman discovered it during what appeared to be a routine security sweep of the compound, left behind by one of their guards. Maybe this is a sign, Racheal suggested when Kemi showed her the weapon. Maybe you're supposed to be able to protect yourself and your family. Kemi stared at the gun with a mixture of fear and fascination. She had never held a weapon before, but in her current mental state it represented power and control in a situation where she felt completely helpless. Racheal spent the following weeks subtly encouraging Kemi to familiarize herself with the weapon, framing it as a necessary skill for personal protection. Each lesson moved Kemi closer to a tragedy that would destroy what remained of her family. Racheal's final manipulation of Kemi was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. She arranged for the young woman to overhear a staged phone conversation in which she appeared to be warning someone about an imminent threat to the Adeleke family. "They're planning something for tonight," Racheal said in an urgent whisper, making sure Kemi could hear every word. "The compound isn't safe. They know about the security changes." The conversation was entirely fictional, but to Kemi's paranoid mind, it confirmed her worst fears. Her family was in immediate danger, the security measures had been compromised, and she was the only one who could protect them. In her fractured mental state, the logical response was to take preemptive action against the perceived threat. Racheal had successfully turned Kemi into a weapon, aimed at her own family, primed and ready to fire. That night, as Chief Adeleke worked late in his home office reviewing contracts, Kemi crept through the darkened house with the pistol clutched in her trembling hands. In her paranoid state, every shadow looked like an intruder, every sound seemed threatening. When her father's office door creaked open unexpectedly, Kemi's overwrought nerves finally snapped completely. Chief Adeleke looked up from his papers to see his daughter silhouetted in the doorway, her face twisted with fear and confusion. A gun pointed directly at his chest. "Kemi?" he said, rising slowly from his chair. "What's wrong, my dear?" But in her fractured mental state, even her father's familiar voice sounded threatening and alien. The gun fired before she fully realized what she was doing. And Chief Adeleke collapsed behind his mahogany desk, his blood spreading across contracts worth millions of naira.
The sound of the gunshot brought security guards running, but it was too late. Chief Adeleke lay dying on his office floor, while Kemi stood over him in catatonic shock, the smoking gun still clutched in her hands. By the time paramedics arrived, Lagos's most powerful businessman was dead, killed by his own daughter in a moment of psychological breakdown that no one could have predicted or prevented. Funmi's screams echoed through the compound as she discovered the scene. Her husband dead, her daughter clearly responsible, her family destroyed in a single instant of madness. Kemi was arrested immediately, though her mental state was so completely shattered that she couldn't even explain why she had pulled the trigger. The investigation would reveal no clear motive, no external threat, nothing that made sense of why a loving daughter would murder her own father in cold blood. When news of his father's death reached Tolu in London, his response was explosive and immediate. He caught the first flight to Lagos, consumed by a rage that made his previous rebellious behavior seem mild by comparison. He refused to believe that his sister had acted alone, convinced that she had been manipulated or coerced into pulling the trigger by the same forces that had killed David.
Racheal met him at the airport, playing the role of the grieving family friend who had been trying to help Kemi through her psychological crisis.
"I'm so sorry,"
She told him as he wept with fury and grief.
"I tried to get her professional help, but she wouldn't listen. She was so convinced that your family was in danger."
Her words were designed to redirect his anger away from Kemi and toward the imaginary enemies that had driven his sister to madness, setting the stage for the final phase of her revenge.
Detective Inspector Ogilvy had been monitoring the Adeleke family since David's suspicious death, and Chief Adeleke's murder by his own daughter raised even more questions. 2 deaths in less than a year seemed like more than coincidence, especially given Kemi's claims about external threats that no one else could substantiate. She began digging deeper into the family's recent associates, particularly focusing on anyone who had gained access to their inner circle.
Racheal's false identity as quote-unquote Racheal Johnson was sophisticated but not perfect. A thorough investigation would eventually reveal inconsistencies in her background, gaps in her employment history, and discrepancies in her charitable work claims. Detective Ogilvy was methodical and relentless, and she was beginning to piece together a pattern that pointed toward a calculated campaign of psychological warfare against the Adeleke family. The net was slowly tightening around Racheal, but she still had one final move to make. Driven by grief and rage, Tolu began his own investigation into his family's destruction. He was convinced that David had been murdered and Kemi manipulated, and he was determined to find the person responsible. His criminal contacts in Lagos's underworld provided him with resources that the official investigation lacked, people willing to use violence and intimidation to extract information. Racheal watched Tolu's investigation with interest, understanding that his emotional state and criminal methods would ultimately lead him to her. She began preparing for their final confrontation, the moment when she would reveal her true identity and explain exactly why his family had been systematically destroyed. Tolu's quest for vengeance would provide the perfect opportunity for her to deliver the psychological coup de grace that would complete her mother's revenge. With Chief Adeleke dead and his affairs in chaos, his business empire began to collapse with stunning speed. Partners withdrew from deals, investors demanded immediate repayment of loans, and competitors moved quickly to acquire his most valuable assets at bargain prices. The telecommunications company was seized by regulators, the real estate ventures were liquidated to pay debts, and the oil interests were sold to foreign investors. Within 6 months, the Adeleke fortune that had taken decades to build was completely gone. Funmi, now widowed and facing her daughter's murder trial, discovered that her husband's death had left the family not just emotionally devastated, but financially ruined as well. The mansion would have to be sold, the luxury cars repossessed, the lifestyle of privilege that had defined their existence completely eliminated. Racheal watched the empire's collapse with deep satisfaction.
This was the poverty her mother had died in, now visited upon the family that had lived in luxury while Grace Adeleke suffered. Kemi's trial for her father's murder became a media sensation, with Lagos's elite watching in fascination as one of their own families destroyed itself in the most public way possible. The prosecution argued that Kemi had suffered a complete psychological breakdown, brought on by her brother's death, and had killed her father in a moment of paranoid delusion. The defense claimed she had been manipulated by unknown parties who had driven her to madness for their own purposes. Racheal attended every day of the trial, sitting in the back of the courtroom and watching as the legal system processed the destruction she had orchestrated. Kemi sat in the defendant's chair like a broken doll, her once bright eyes now hollow and vacant. The vibrant, intelligent young woman who had dreamed of changing the world through international relations was gone, replaced by a shell of psychological trauma and pharmaceutical sedation. It was a fitting punishment for the daughter who had enjoyed privileges that should have been Racheal's. Tolu's investigation had finally led him to, quote, Racheal Johnson, end quote, and he was beginning to uncover the inconsistencies in her background that Detective Ogilvy had also discovered. His criminal contacts had traced her movements over the past year, documenting her systematic infiltration of his family's inner circle. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. She had been present at every crucial moment, had influenced every fatal decision, had guided his family toward their destruction with surgical precision. He confronted her at a coffee shop in Victoria Island, the same place where she had first approached Kemi months earlier. "I know what you are," he said quietly, his voice deadly calm despite the rage burning in his eyes. "I know what you've done to my family. The question is, why?" Racheal smiled at him across the table, recognizing that the moment she had been building toward for over a year had finally arrived. It was time to reveal the truth. "Sad because your father destroyed my family first," Racheal said, simply, her mask of false identity finally dropping away completely. She pulled out her phone and showed Tolu the same photos she had shown David, Grace Adeleke in her youth, Chief Adeleke as a young man, the evidence of a relationship and a daughter that had been erased from official family history. Tolu stared at the photos in shock, seeing the undeniable resemblance between this woman and his own family features. "You're our sister," he whispered, the revelation hitting him like a physical blow. "You're Papa's first daughter." Racheal nodded, her expression cold and satisfied. "The daughter he abandoned. The daughter whose mother died begging for his help while you lived in luxury. The daughter who decided that if she meant nothing to him, his precious family would mean nothing to her." Over the next hour, Racheal laid out the complete truth of her campaign of revenge. She explained how she had infiltrated their lives, manipulated their emotions, and orchestrated the destruction with calculated precision. David's murder, Kemi's psychological breakdown, their father's death, the collapse of the business empire, every tragedy had been carefully planned and expertly executed. "You could have just talked to us," Tolu said desperately, still hoping to find some path back from the brink of complete destruction. "We would have helped you, acknowledged you as family, shared everything we had." Racheal laughed, but the sound was hollow and bitter. "With what? Your father's charity? Your pity for the abandoned daughter he tried to erase? I didn't want your help, Tolu. I wanted your suffering. I wanted him to understand what it felt like to lose everything that mattered while being powerless to stop it." Faced with the truth of his family's destruction, Tolu was consumed by a rage that eclipsed anything he had felt before. The woman sitting across from him had systematically murdered his brother, driven his sister to madness, caused his father's death, and destroyed everything his family had built over generations. She sat there, calmly explaining her actions as if they were reasonable responses to an old injustice, showing no remorse for the innocent lives she had destroyed. He reached for the knife he always carried, the same weapon he had used in London's underground fighting circles. Racheal made no move to defend herself, seemingly at peace with whatever consequences her actions had earned. "Go ahead," she said quietly. "Kill me. It won't bring them back, won't restore your family, won't undo any of the damage. But it might make you feel better for a few moments." Her words were a challenge, daring him to become the same kind of monster she had become. Detective Inspector Ogilvy arrived at the coffee shop just as Tolu raised the knife, having traced both of them to this location through her investigation. "Stop!" she commanded, her service weapon drawn and trained on Tolu. "Put the weapon down and step away from her." The entire cafe erupted in panic as customers realized they were witnessing the final act of the Adeleke family tragedy.
Tolu hesitated, the knife trembling in his hand as he looked between the detective and the woman who had destroyed his world. Racheal watched calmly, seemingly indifferent to whether she lived or died, now that her revenge was complete. "She killed my family," Tolu said, his voice breaking with emotion. "She deserves to die for what she's done." Detective Ogilvy nodded grimly. "Maybe she does, but not by your hand. Not today. You've lost too much already to throw your life away on revenge."
Racheal Adeleke was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, and fraud. The evidence against her was overwhelming once investigators knew where to look, and she made no attempt to deny her guilt or escape responsibility for her actions. During a trial, she testified calmly about her motives and methods, showing the same cold precision she had used to destroy the Adeleke family.
The media coverage was intense, with the story capturing public attention as a modern tragedy of abandonment, revenge, and the terrible price of past sins. Some viewed Racheal as a monster who had committed unforgivable crimes against innocent people. Others saw her as a victim of Chief Adeleke's cruelty, who had been driven to extremes by poverty and abandonment. The truth, as always, was more complex than either narrative could capture.
5 years later, Racheal sat in her prison cell, finally at peace with the choices she had made. Chief Adebayo Adeleke's empire was gone, his legacy destroyed, his family scattered and broken. Kemi remained in a psychiatric facility, her mind too damaged by trauma to ever fully recover. Tolu had returned to London, where he struggled with addiction and survivor's guilt. Funmi had died 2 years earlier, her heart finally giving out under the weight of grief and loss.
The Adeleke name, once synonymous with success and power in Lagos, was now associated with tragedy and destruction. Grace Adeleke's daughter had achieved the revenge she had promised at her mother's graveside, but the victory felt hollow now in the silence of her cell. She had destroyed her father's family, but she had also destroyed herself in the process. The cycle of abandonment and revenge was complete, leaving only emptiness and the bitter knowledge that some victories cost more than defeats ever could. In seeking to balance the scales of justice, Racheal had learned that revenge, like love, was a force that consumed everything it touched, including those who wielded it.